June wiped his sweaty palms on his pants for the 5th time in as many minutes. Today marked his 2nd month as the human cultural liaison on Harmony Point, the massive space station built as a meeting place for the dozen species now part of the Galactic Union. His job was simple on paper: help the newly arrived Viridians understand humans. In practice, it was anything but simple. The Viridians were reptilian humanoids with iridescent scales that shifted colors with their moods. They stood a head shorter than most humans, but were known for their incredible strength and rigid social structures. And they were arriving in less than 10 minutes. "Nervous?" asked Captain Wu as she stopped beside him in the docking bay. "A little," June admitted. "This is my first solo assignment." "You'll do fine," she said with a smile. "Just remember, they're as curious about us as we are about them." The docking bay doors hissed open, and the Viridian delegation stepped through. 5 of them, all dressed in what looked like battle armor despite this being a diplomatic mission. The 4 larger Viridians walked in first, their scales glimmering with blues and greens. Behind them came a smaller figure, scales more purple-tinged. "Welcome to Harmony Point," Captain Wu said, stepping forward with her hand extended. "I'm Captain Wu, and this is June, who will be your cultural liaison during your stay." The lead Viridian looked at her hand with confusion before awkwardly extending his own scaled hand. "I am Tahoe, lead diplomat of the Viridian Consortium. These are my security officers, and this," he gestured to the smaller Viridian, "is Nara, our xenobiologist." June noticed that Nara's scales flickered briefly with a bright yellow pattern before settling back to purple. Interesting. He'd need to study their color changes more. "It's an honor to meet you all," June said with a slight bow. "I've prepared quarters for your team and can show you there now." As they walked through the station, June couldn't help but notice how the Viridians walked in formation, the 4 males forming a protective square around Nara. They passed through a busy corridor where station crew were moving supplies. A human woman approached from the opposite direction, her arms full of equipment. Without thinking, Jum stepped to the side and held his arm out, stopping the Viridian group. "Just a moment," he said politely, allowing the woman to pass first. "Thank you," she said with a nod as she passed. June noticed Nara's scales flash bright orange, her head tilted to the side, reptilian eyes blinking rapidly. But she said nothing. The same thing happened when they reached the turbolift. June automatically gestured for Captain Wu to enter first, then indicated that Nara should follow. "Please, after you," he said. Nara froze, her scales now pulsing between orange and yellow. She looked at Tahoe, who seemed equally confused but nodded for her to enter. Over the next 2 weeks, June showed the Viridians around the station, explaining human customs and helping them navigate the complex multicultural environment of Harmony Point. He couldn't help but notice that Nara was always watching him, her scales frequently changing to that same orange-yellow pattern whenever he interacted with human women. One day, while showing her the hydroponics bay where earth plants were grown alongside alien species, June finally asked about it. "I notice your scales change color when you're observing certain interactions. Is that a sign of curiosity?" Nara's scales rippled with blue. "Yes. We express emotions through chromatic displays. Orange indicates confusion. Yellow is interest. The combination means I am confusedly interested." She paused, then added, "Your human behaviors are most confusing." "Which ones specifically?" June asked. "The way males defer to females. It makes no biological sense." Before June could respond, his communicator beeped. "I'm needed at a meeting. Would you like to continue this conversation over dinner tonight?" The station's central dining hall showcases foods from all member species. "That would be acceptable," Nara said, her scales now showing a calm blue with hints of yellow. The dining hall was crowded that evening. Humans mingled with the bird-like avians, the crystalline luminians, and a dozen other species. June spotted Nara sitting alone at a table, her scales a subdued lavender. "May I join you?" he asked. "Please do," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. As they ate, Jun noticed Nera wasn't actually eating much. Instead, she was watching the interactions around them, particularly a young human couple at a nearby table. The male pulled out the sitting device for the female. Nara observed. "Why? It's called a chair," Jun explained. "And that's just a courtesy, a sign of respect." But why would the stronger show deference to the weaker? In Viridian society, strength determines social standing. Males are physically stronger, so they lead and protect. Females are valued for their wisdom and strategic thinking, but they would never be placed in a physically vulnerable position. June considered how to explain. Human society used to be more like that, thousands of years ago. But we evolved socially. We realized that physical strength isn't the only kind of strength that matters. Nera's scales flickered with unconvinced yellow. But the behaviors I observe contradict this. If you truly valued all types of strength equally, why do human males still show these special treatments to females? Holding doors, letting them enter rooms first, standing when they approach. These seem like protective behaviors that acknowledge physical differences. Before Jum could answer, a loud crash came from the kitchen area. One of the chefs had dropped a tray of dishes. Without hesitation, several people nearby, men and women alike, jumped up to help clean the mess. "See," Jun said, "humans help each other regardless of gender." "But that's different," Nara insisted. "That's just basic cooperation. I'm talking about the special treatment." Their conversation was interrupted when Captain Wu approached their table. Jun automatically stood up, a gesture that made Nera's scales flash bright orange again. "Sorry to interrupt your dinner," Captain Wu said. "Jun, we've had a request from the Viridian ship. They'd like to send more scientists to study our propulsion systems. I need you to coordinate with them." "Of course, Captain," Jun replied. After Captain Wu left, Jun sat back down to find Nera staring at him intently. "You stood when she approached. She is your superior, yes. That I understand. But earlier today, you stood when Dr. Kim entered the lab, and she is not your superior." "It's just politeness," Jun said. "But you don't stand when males enter." "Well, no, it's a specific courtesy toward women." Nera's scales now turned a deep, frustrated red. "This makes no sense. You say you value all kinds of strength equally, but you treat females differently. You say it's respect, but special treatment suggests they need protection or assistance. How is this not contradictory?" Jun realized he'd never really thought about it this way before. How could he explain customs that were so ingrained he performed them without thinking? "It's complicated," he began. "These customs come from older times when women were treated as weaker and in need of protection. But today, they're just traditions that show consideration. So you admit they originated from a belief in female weakness?" Nora pressed. "Well, yes, but why do females go first, human?" Nara suddenly exclaimed, loud enough that several nearby diners turned to look. Her scales were now flashing rapidly between red and orange. "It defies logical social organization. If there is danger, shouldn't the physically stronger go first? If there is limited space, shouldn't those with higher rank enter first? Your customs contradict sensible risk assessment." Jun sat back, surprised by her outburst. He'd never considered how these everyday courtesies might appear to a species with different social structures. "I think," he said slowly, "that human courtesy is less about logic and more about showing we care about each other. It's symbolic now, not practical." Nera's scales gradually calmed to a thoughtful blue. Symbolic behaviors without practical function. Interesting. Viridians value efficiency. We would not maintain customs that serve no practical purpose. "Don't Viridians have any traditions that aren't strictly practical?" Jun asked. Nera seemed to consider this. "Perhaps some of our mating rituals have become more elaborate than necessary for simple reproduction." Her scales suddenly flushed a deep purple, which Jun guessed might be their equivalent of a blush. "I've made you uncomfortable," he said. "I'm sorry." "No," Nera said, her scales returning to blue. "You've given me something to think about. These human customs may be more complex than I first assumed." She stood up abruptly. "I need to document these observations and consider their implications. I will study this human phenomenon thoroughly. Your species is most puzzling, June." As she left, Jum couldn't help but smile. In his cultural liaison training, they'd stressed that understanding goes both ways. He had a feeling he was going to learn as much about Viridians as Nera would about humans. What he didn't anticipate was how much he'd learn about his own species by seeing human customs through alien eyes. For 3 days after their dinner conversation, Nera avoided June. He spotted her occasionally in the station's common areas, but whenever he approached, she would quickly walk away, her scales flashing a mix of yellow and green. On the 4th day, Jun was working in his office when his door chimed. "Come in," he called. The door slid open to reveal Nera, her scales a determined blue. She was carrying what looked like a tablet computer. "I have developed an experimental protocol," she announced without greeting. "Good morning to you too," Jum said with a smile. "Experimental protocol for what?" "For understanding the illogical human custom of females first," she said as if it were obvious. "I require your assistance." June leaned back in his chair. "You want my help to study human courtesy?" "Yes, I have many questions that require answers through direct observation and participation." She held up her tablet. "I have created a list of scenarios to test." June couldn't help but laugh, which made Nera's scales flash an indignant red. "You find my scientific inquiry amusing?" she asked stiffly. No, June said quickly. "I just wasn't expecting this. But I'm happy to help. What kind of scenarios did you have in mind?" Nera's scales settled back to blue as she consulted her tablet. "First, I wish to observe a social gathering where these customs are practiced naturally. Is there such an event happening soon?" June thought for a moment. "Actually, there's a welcome reception tonight for the new Luminian ambassador. That would be perfect. It's formal enough that people will be on their best behavior." "Excellent," Nera said, making a note. "Second, I wish to experience these customs directly. In my culture, we learn through participation." "You want me to treat you like a human woman?" June asked carefully. "Yes, I wish to understand the experience from both perspectives, both as the one receiving this courtesy and as the one giving it." June hesitated. Some of these customs might not translate well across species. "That is precisely what makes this scientifically valuable," Nera insisted, her scales now pulsing with eager yellow highlights. "Will you assist me or not?" "Of course," Jum said. "When would you like to start?" "Now," Nera said firmly. "I have allocated the entire day to this study." Their first stop was the station's garden dome, a large open space filled with plants from a dozen worlds. As they walked through the entrance, Jun automatically held the door open. "There," Nera said, pointing at his hand on the door. "Why did you do that?" "It's polite to hold the door for someone following you," Jun explained. "But you specifically positioned yourself so that I would enter first." "Why?" Jun had to think about it. "It's just what feels right. If we arrive at a door together, I'll open it and let you go first." "But what if there was danger on the other side? On a space station?" "Hypothetically," Nera pressed. "In your ancient past, wouldn't it have been dangerous to let the physically weaker individual enter an unknown space first?" "I suppose so," Joan admitted. "Maybe that's why it feels special now, because it's a sign of trust and safety. I'm showing you that I know there's no danger, so I can focus on being considerate instead of protective." Nera made a note on her tablet, her scales showing thoughtful blue patterns. "Let us continue to the next test." Throughout the morning, they visited various parts of the station, with June demonstrating different courtesies. He pulled out a chair for her in the cafe, carried a package she picked up from the station's store, and offered her his jacket when they visited the slightly too cold hydroponics bay. Each time, Nara took detailed notes and asked probing questions that June often struggled to answer. But why did the custom persist after the practical need disappeared? She asked repeatedly. Traditions often outlive their original purpose, was the best answer June could give. They become part of how we connect with each other. After lunch, they encountered Engineer Da, a human who worked in the propulsion section. June had met him a few times but didn't know him well. "Da, this is Nara from the Viridian delegation." June introduced them. "She's studying human social customs." "Fascinating," Da said with genuine interest. "Which customs in particular?" "The irrational practice of females first," Nara said bluntly. "June has been demonstrating, but I would value additional perspective." Da laughed. "My grandmother would love you. She was always telling me to mind my manners and be a gentleman." "Gentleman?" Nara's scales flickered with curiosity. "This is a special category of male. It's an old term for a man who follows traditional courtesies and behavioral codes," Da explained. "My grandmother was very traditional. She immigrated from Seoul and brought all the old customs with her." Nara's scales pulsed with excitement. "Would you be willing to join our experiment? Multiple data points would strengthen my analysis." "Sure," Da said with a shrug. "I'm off duty now anyway. What did you have in mind?" "Perhaps we could continue this in a more social setting," June suggested. "The reception tonight would be perfect." "I'll meet you there," Da agreed. That evening, Nara arrived at the reception wearing what appeared to be a modified version of her usual uniform. Instead of the practical jumpsuit she normally wore, this outfit had decorative elements that mimicked formal human attire while accommodating her reptilian features. June was waiting near the entrance with Da. Both men wore their formal uniforms. "You look nice," June said as Nara approached. "I have researched human compliments and appropriate responses," Nara said, her scales briefly flashing purple. "Thank you. You also appear aesthetically pleasing in your formal attire." Day covered a laugh with a cough, and June shot him a warning look. As they entered the reception hall, Dai stepped forward and opened the door with a small bow. "After you," he said gallantly. Nara hesitated, then walked through. June followed, and Da came last, letting the door close behind them. Inside, the reception was already bustling with diplomats and station personnel from various species. A server approached with a tray of drinks. "Try this," Jum said, taking 2 glasses and offering one to Nara. "It's a human beverage called champagne. It's customary at celebrations." Nara took the glass carefully and sipped. Her scales immediately flashed a surprised orange, then settled into a pleased pink hue June hadn't seen before. "The carbonation creates an interesting sensory experience," she noted, taking another sip. As they mingled, June noticed Nara watching carefully as different humans interacted. She seemed particularly interested in a group of senior officers, where both men and women held leadership positions. "Your Captain Wu outranks many males," Nara observed. "Yet they still perform these courtesy behaviors toward her. Doesn't this undermine her authority?" "Not at all," Daz said. "Those little courtesies have nothing to do with her ability to command. Actually, it would be disrespectful not to show her the same considerations we show other women, just because she's our superior." "Fascinating," Nara murmured, her scales showing that now familiar pattern of confused interest. Suddenly, an alarm blared through the reception hall. Red lights flashed along the walls. "Attention all personnel," came a voice over the station's communication system. "We have a minor fire in residential section D. This is not an evacuation situation. Please stay where you are while the response team handles the situation." Despite the announcement, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Captain Wu quickly moved to the center of the room. "Everything is under control," she assured everyone. "Our safety systems are containing the fire, and our response team is already on site." Nara watched intently as the human response team, a mix of men and women, coordinated efficiently through their communication devices. The captain issued commands that were followed immediately, regardless of whether she was speaking to male or female crew members. The emergency response doesn't follow your courtesy customs, Nara noted. The females aren't being protected or placed behind males. Of course not, Jun said. In an emergency, what matters is who has the skills and authority to handle the situation. Gender is irrelevant. But that contradicts everything you've shown me today, Nara insisted, her scales now pulsing with confusion. If these courtesies are about protection, why abandon them when protection is most needed? Before Jun could answer, the alarm silenced, and the lights returned to normal. Captain Mu announced that the fire had been successfully contained, with no injuries and minimal damage. As the reception resumed, Nara fell silent, her scales shifting slowly between blue and yellow as she processed what she had observed. "Are you all right?" Jun asked after a while. "I am, reconsidering my hypotheses," Nara said slowly. "If your courtesy customs are not truly about protection or hierarchy, then I must develop new theories about their purpose." "Maybe it's not as complicated as you're making it," Daz suggested. "Maybe these customs just help us remember to be kind to each other." Nara's scales flashed skeptically. Kindness without practical purpose is inefficient. "Is efficiency all that matters?" Jun asked gently. Nara didn't answer immediately. Her scales settled into a calm blue with hints of thoughtful purple. "Perhaps," she said finally, "I need more data. Human social structures appear more complex than I initially assumed. I will continue my observations." As the evening ended, and they prepared to leave, Dai offered Nara his arm in an old-fashioned gesture. "May I escort you back to your quarters?" Nara stared at his arm for a long moment, then slowly placed her scaled hand on it. "For science," she said, but Jun noticed her scales had flushed that same pleased pink color as when she tasted the champagne. Watching them walk away, Jun couldn't help but smile. Nara's experiment was just beginning, and he had a feeling her research was going to lead her to conclusions she never expected. A week had passed since the reception. Nara had continued her research, often accompanied by either Jun or Dai, as she observed human interactions across the station. Her tablet was now filled with notes, observations, and half-formed theories. Jun found her in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Her scales were a calm blue with swirls of thoughtful purple. "How's the research going?" he asked, sitting beside her. "Inconclusive," she admitted. "Every time I develop a theory that explains one aspect of human courtesy, I observe something that contradicts it." She showed him her tablet. "Look at these data points." Jun scanned the neat columns of observations she had recorded. Some were labeled supporting evidence, protection theory, while others fell under contradictory evidence, protection theory. Similar categories existed for what she called status theory and mating ritual theory. "This is very thorough," Jun said, impressed by her detailed work. "But ultimately unsuccessful," Nara said, her scales briefly flashing a frustrated red. "I cannot determine a single logical explanation for these customs." "Maybe there isn't one," Jun suggested. "Human behaviors evolve from many different influences: history, culture, practical needs, emotions." Before Nara could respond, their communicators beeped simultaneously. It was an official message from Captain Wu. "All diplomatic staff report to Conference Room A immediately. The Coral delegation has arrived ahead of schedule." The Coral. Nara's scales paled to a light blue that Jun had learned indicated surprise or alarm. They weren't expected for another 2 weeks. "Who are the Coral?" Jun asked as they hurried toward the conference room. "A species from a system near Viridian space," Nara explained. "Very militaristic, very hierarchical, even more so than my people." Her scales darkened to a worried gray. "They can be difficult." When they reached Conference Room A, it was already filled with station officials and diplomats. Captain Wu stood at the front with Ambassador Hana, the station's chief diplomatic officer. Beside them were 5 tall, powerfully built aliens with tough, gray-ridged skin and sharp, bony protrusions along their forearms and shoulders. June and Nara took seats near the back as Captain Wu began the meeting. "As you can see, the Coral delegation has arrived earlier than expected," she explained. "Ambassador Hannah will now lead the diplomatic welcome." As Ambassador Hannah stepped forward, June noticed the Coral leader's posture stiffen. The alien's eyes narrowed, and its ridges seemed to expand slightly. "On behalf of the Galactic Union and Harmony Point Station, I welcome you," Ambassador Hannah began. The Coral leader cut her off with a sharp gesture. "We will speak with your male leader," he said in a deep, gravelly voice, not his assistant. A tense silence fell over the room. Ambassador Hannah remained composed, her expression neutral. "I am not an assistant," she said calmly. "I am the chief diplomatic officer of this station and the authorized representative of the Galactic Union in these negotiations." The Coral leader made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Females do not lead negotiations. It is not the natural order." He turned to Captain Wu. "You command this station, yet you allow this. Where is your strength?" Captain Wu's expression remained professional, but June could see her jaw tighten. "Ambassador Hannah has my complete confidence and authority. On this station and throughout the human systems, leadership is based on ability and experience, not gender." The Coral leader's ridges fully extended now, making him appear larger. "Unnatural. Inefficient. In Coral society, each has their proper place. Males lead and protect. Females nurture and support. This is the way of all strong species." Nara, who had been silent until now, leaned closer to June. "This is exactly how Viridians thought until recently," she whispered. "Watch carefully. This will be interesting." Ambassador Hannah remained unruffled. Different species develop different social structures based on their evolutionary path and environment. In humans, we found that limiting leadership to half our population was inefficient and wasteful of talent. Our current system has led to unprecedented advances in technology, exploration, and diplomacy. The Coral leader stepped closer to her, using his height to loom over the human woman. "Your soft ways make you weak. Perhaps you are not worthy allies after all." June felt tension ripple through the room. The other Coral had shifted their positions slightly, moving their hands closer to what appeared to be weapons on their belts. What happened next surprised everyone. Nara stood up, her scales now a bold, assertive orange. "I am Nara, xenobiologist of the Viridian Consortium," she announced. "May I offer an observation?" All eyes turned to her. The Coral leader looked annoyed at the interruption, but nodded curtly. "Viridians once shared your view of natural order," Nara said. "When we first encountered humans, we too were confused by their customs and social structure. But after careful study, I have observed something remarkable." She stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "Humans have the lowest rate of internal conflict of any species in the Galactic Union. Their collaborative approach to leadership results in more creative problem-solving and faster technological advancement than our more rigid hierarchies." The Coral leader's ridges flattened slightly. "What is your point, Viridian?" "My point is that what appears to be weakness might actually be strength," Nara said. "When humans allow females to go first through doorways or sit before males do, it is not because females are weaker or need protection. It is because humans have evolved beyond needing to constantly assert dominance." She moved to stand beside Ambassador Hannah. "They can afford these courtesies precisely because they are secure in their strength. They don't need to prove it at every moment, as we do. As you do." The room fell silent again. The Coral leader's ridges contracted fully, a sign June couldn't interpret. Finally, the alien spoke. "You speak boldly for a female of your species." "Yes," Nara agreed, her scales now a confident blue. "Perhaps I too have learned something from the humans." Ambassador Hannah smoothly stepped back into the conversation. "Let us sit together and discuss the potential benefits of alliance. You'll find that the Galactic Union values the unique strengths of all its member species. After a tense moment, the coral leader nodded. We will listen. For now. As the meeting reorganized, June caught Nara's eye and nodded appreciatively. Her scales briefly flashed that pleased pink color before returning to a professional blue. Hours later, after the initial negotiations had concluded and the coral delegation had been shown to their quarters, Jun found Nara in the station's garden dome. She was sitting on a bench, making notes on her tablet. That was impressive, he said, sitting beside her. You might have prevented a diplomatic incident. I merely applied scientific observation, she said, but her scales showed pleased purple ripples. The coral reminded me of how I first viewed humans. It helped me see how far my understanding has evolved. And what do you understand now? June asked. Nara's scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. I think I'd finally understand why females go first in your culture, she said slowly. It's not about protection or weakness. It's about something else entirely. She turned to look at him directly. When your ancestors were more primitive, physical strength determined leadership, just as it does for Viridians and coral. Males dominated because they could. But at some point, humans made a choice to value more than just physical power. That's true, June agreed, though it took us a long time, and we're still working on it. These courtesies, holding doors, standing when females enter, offering assistance with physical tasks, they're not about females being weak. They're reminders that strength isn't everything. They're small daily rituals that reinforce a different set of values. June smiled. I never thought about it that way, but I think you're right. It's fascinating, Nara continued, her scales now pulsing with excited yellow. Your species found a way to evolve socially beyond your biological programming. Viridians still struggle with this. The coral haven't even begun. She looked down at her tablet and made another note. I wonder if this is why humans have advanced so quickly in space exploration and diplomacy. You waste less energy on dominance displays and more on cooperation. We still have plenty of problems, Jun reminded her. Of course, Nara agreed. But you found a path forward that neither Viridians nor coral have discovered yet. Her scales shifted to a color Jun hadn't seen before, a deep, rich purple with silver highlights. It gives me hope for my own species. As they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars through the garden dome's clear roof, Jun realized something had changed. Nara was no longer just studying humans as curious specimens. She was beginning to see value in their differences. And perhaps, he thought, he was beginning to see Viridians differently too. Not as rigid and hierarchical, but as a species with their own journey and potential for growth. Ambassador Hannah handled the coral leader perfectly, Nara observed after a while. She didn't try to dominate him or submit to him. She simply stood her ground with confidence. That's what makes her a good diplomat, June agreed. Do you think the coral can learn to see things differently, as I have? Nara asked. June considered this. It will probably take time. Change usually does. But meeting different species, seeing different ways of organizing society. That's how we all grow. Nara nodded, her scales settling into a peaceful blue. In my initial report to the Viridian Consortium, I called human courtesy customs inefficient and illogical. I think I need to revise my conclusions. Oh, what will you say now? June asked. Nara's scales rippled with thoughtful patterns. I will tell them that human customs contain wisdom we have yet to discover, and that sometimes the most strength is shown by those who don't need to display it constantly. As the station's day cycle dimmed to simulate evening, June stood and offered Nara his hand to help her up, a human courtesy. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. 3 months had passed since the coral delegation's visit. The negotiations had been difficult, but ultimately successful, with the coral agreeing to join the Galactic Union under certain conditions. To everyone's surprise, The Coral had specifically requested that Ambassador Hannah lead the final treaty discussions, claiming her unique perspective was valuable. Harmony Point Station was busier than ever. New delegations arrived weekly as word spread about the growing alliance of species. Among them was a new group of Viridians, scientists, engineers, and diplomats eager to expand their role in the Galactic Union. June watched from the observation deck as their ship docked. Beside him stood Nera, her scales a calm, confident blue. In the past months, she had become something of an unofficial cultural ambassador between humans and Viridians. Her detailed reports on human customs had become required reading for all Viridians assigned to work with humans. Nervous? June asked. A little, Nara admitted, her scales briefly flickering with yellow. Some of these Viridians are senior scientists from our most prestigious research institutions. They may not appreciate having a junior xenobiologist explain human customs to them. They'll listen, June assured her. Your work has been groundbreaking. The docking bay doors opened, and 6 Viridians entered the station. 5 males and 1 female, all wearing the formal armor of Viridian officials. Captain Wu and Dai were there to greet them. Shall we go meet them? June suggested. Nera nodded, and they made their way to the docking bay. By the time they arrived, Captain Wu was already leading the Viridians down the corridor. Dai spotted them and waved them over. This is perfect timing, he said. I was just about to show our guests to their quarters. The lead Viridian, a large male with deep green scales, stepped forward. I am Ba, head scientist of the Viridian Academy. This is my research team. He gestured to the others, ending with the female. And this is Suk, our cultural specialist. Nera's scales flickered with surprise. Cultural specialist. That's a new position for a Viridian delegation. Indeed, Ba said. Your reports have created quite a stir back home. The consortium decided we needed dedicated experts to study alien cultures more thoroughly. As they began walking toward the guest quarters, they approached a doorway where a human crew member was coming from the opposite direction, carrying maintenance equipment. Without thinking, Dai stopped the group with a raised hand, allowing the crew member to pass through first. Thank you, the man said with a nod before continuing on his way. The youngest Viridian male, who June would later learn was named Jin, flashed bright orange scales. Why did you stop us? He demanded, looking at Dai. We are the diplomatic delegation. We should have priority passage. Before Dai could respond, another Viridian spoke up. It's a human courtesy custom. Jin, didn't you read researcher Nera's reports? I skimmed them, Jin admitted, his scales now showing embarrassed purple. But it still makes no sense. Why do others go first, human? The question was so familiar that June couldn't help but smile. It was almost exactly what Nera had asked months ago. To everyone's surprise, it was Nera who answered. It's not about who goes first, she explained, her scales a confident blue. It's about recognizing that true strength can be shown through consideration rather than dominance. She looked at Jin directly. Humans define power differently than we do. Jin's scales flickered with confusion. But the logical order in any group is for the strongest to lead and protect. This is basic social organization. For many species, yes, Nera agreed. But humans discovered something different. They found that when they valued more than just physical strength, when they also valued intelligence, creativity, empathy, and cooperation, their society advanced more quickly. To demonstrate, Nera did something that shocked the Viridian delegation. She stepped forward, opened the next door they approached, and held it for all of them, males included. Please proceed, she said calmly. The Viridians hesitated, their scales showing various shades of confusion and surprise. Finally, Ba stepped through, followed by the others. Jin was last, his scales now pulsing with curious yellow. You see, Nera said as they continued walking, no one's status was diminished by that simple courtesy. In fact, it created a moment of connection between us. Fascinating, Suk said, speaking for the first time. Her scales showed intellectual interest. And humans do this naturally, without conscious thought. Most of the time, Jum confirmed. These customs are taught to us from childhood. They become automatic. As they reached the guest quarters, Captain Wu excused herself to attend to other duties. Dai offered to give the new delegation a tour of the station later. I would like to hear more about these customs, Jin said, his initial hostility replaced with curiosity. The reports didn't explain the emotional aspects. I'd be happy to discuss it further, Nera offered. Perhaps over dinner tonight. The Viridians agreed, and soon dispersed to settle into their quarters. As June, Dai, and Nera walked away, Dai grinned at Nera. You've come a long way from "why do females go first, human?" he said, mimicking her earlier outraged tone. Nera's scales flashed with amused purple. I have learned much, though I still have questions. Like what? June asked. Like why humans insist on making everything so complicated, she said, but her scales showed she was joking. A simple dominance hierarchy would be much easier to understand, but far less interesting, Dai pointed out. Later that evening, June found himself in the garden dome again. It had become his favorite place to think, especially when the station's day cycle was ending and the artificial lighting dimmed to mimic sunset. He wasn't alone. Nara sat on a bench nearby, watching human families who were visiting the station. Her attention seemed focused on a human father who was patiently teaching his young daughter how to care for one of the plants. They are gentle with their young, she observed as June sat beside her, both protecting them and encouraging independence. That's the goal of good parenting, June agreed. In Viridian culture, young males are expected to show strength early. Young females are taught to be strategic and cautious. Her scales shifted to a thoughtful blue. We don't emphasize gentleness. Every species has its own way, June said diplomatically. Yes, but some ways may be better than others. Nara turned to face him directly. I think I finally understand the true answer to my original question. Oh, why females go first in human culture? It's not about protection or status or even courtesy. Not really. Her scales shimmered with deep purple. The color June had learned indicated profound insight or emotion for Viridians. It's about choice, she continued. Humans reached a point in their development where they could choose values beyond simple survival. You chose to value consideration. You chose to create customs that remind you daily that physical strength isn't the only kind of strength that matters. June nodded slowly. I think you're right, though I'm not sure most humans think about it that deeply. That's what makes it even more remarkable, Nara said. These small courtesies have become so embedded in your culture that you practice them without needing to remember why. They shape your thinking without conscious effort. She looked back at the human father and daughter, who were now laughing together as the child carefully watered the plant. Your species advanced beyond mine in space exploration and diplomacy because you waste less energy on dominance displays and more on cooperation and connection, Nara said. You discovered something my species has yet to fully learn. That consideration isn't weakness. It's actually a foundation of true strength. The next day, June witnessed something he never expected. During a formal tour of the station for the new Viridian delegation, Nara approached a door first. Instead of walking through, she stopped and held it open for the others, both males and females. When Jin looked confused, she simply said, It's a human custom I've adopted. I find it has merit. Jin hesitated, then walked through with a nod of thanks. The other Viridians followed, some with confused scales, others showing curious yellow patterns. Later, during the diplomatic dinner, Jun noticed Jin pull out a chair for Suk. The gesture was awkward, clearly unpracticed, but Suk's scales flashed that same pleased pink that Jun had seen on Nera months ago. Small changes, Jun thought, but meaningful ones. As the dinner ended, Captain Wu raised a glass in a toast. to understanding between species, she said, and to the small courtesies that build bridges between worlds. Nara caught June's eye across the table, and her scales briefly formed a pattern he'd never seen before, deep blue with gold highlights, complex and beautiful. Later, she would tell him it was the Viridian expression for hope. In that moment, June understood that this wasn't just about aliens learning human customs. It was about all species growing together, each bringing their unique strengths and insights to create something greater than any could achieve alone. And it had started with a simple, confused question. Why do females go first, human? Sometimes, June reflected, the simplest questions lead to the most profound answers.